welcome you to Jubagali, now known as Bennelong Point. The Sydney Opera House honours our First Nations by fostering a shared sense of belonging for all Australians. And we pay our deep respects to the Gadigal people, traditional custodians of Jubagali. Welcome to the Sydney Opera House and enjoy the show.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this very, very special UTZON Lecture celebrating 50 years of this wonderful building. My name's Edwina Throsby, and I've worked in the arts for most of my career, including a wonderful 4 years working here as one of the heads of program, and I'm just so happy to be here at this time. I'd like to also welcome the people that are joining us on our live stream from all around the country and all around the world. And of course, a special welcome to Jan and Lin Utzon, who are here with us tonight, and to Richard Johnson, who are joining me on stage, and to all of the Utzon family members who are in the audience tonight. We have got so many descendants. We have children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren who've come from around the world to be here for this occasion. I'd also like to welcome the many, many people who are in the audience tonight who worked in some way on the construction of this building. People who worked on the original construction back in the 1960s and 1970s. People who were involved in the renovations that were done in the late 90s and early 2000s. And people who were part of the most recent renewal project, which we're all enjoying and which has made this building more accessible to everybody. I think that it's clear that this building inspires a lot of pride and invites a lot of pride, whether you've worked here, whether you've worked on building it, whether you're related to the genius who constructed it, or whether you just simply were born or live in the city that it stands in. It's a masterpiece and a marvel, and it just feels absolutely right that we're marking this occasion of 50 years here tonight. But now, on behalf of the Sydney Opera House, I'd like to welcome the Dean of Art, Design and Architecture of the University of New South Wales, Professor Claire Annesley, who's going to welcome on behalf of the university.
Thank you. Good evening and welcome. Yeah, I'm Claire Annesley and I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Arts, Design and Architecture at the University of New South Wales. It's a great honour to welcome you here, and with that honour, I would also like to acknowledge the Gadigal people as the traditional custodians of Jubagali, the land on which the Opera House now stands. And I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I extend that respect sincerely to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us here tonight. I would also like to acknowledge Her Excellency Pernilla Cardell, the Danish Ambassador, the Danish Consul General Ulrik Dahl, and Deputy Consul General Rika Gambon, all of whom are joining us this evening. UNSW School of Built Environment is so proud to be hosting one of our prestigious UTZON Lectures here at Sydney Opera House, especially in this 50th birthday week. The UTZON Lectures were officially launched in March 2010 by Jan Utzon himself. And here we are again, 13 years later, with Jan giving a really significant public lecture. And we thank you, Jan, one of our most valued alum, for joining us again. And we're really looking forward to hearing from both you and Lynn this evening. At UNSW, we have a commitment to leading research that improves our cities. And we also have a commitment to sharing that knowledge and our compelling stories behind our buildings and our cities to as broad an audience as possible. That's the role of the UTZON Lectures. We've now welcomed over 50 experts from across the world to Sydney, city mayors, world-renowned researchers, policymakers, Pulitzer Prize winners, global architects, all of them coming to share and tell their stories about how we can make cities more sustainable, more equitable, and more resilient. So if you enjoy tonight's event and you feel inspired to explore more of the UTZON Lectures from the past, just please go to UNSW UTZON Lecture Collective. If you search that, you'll find around 50 previous lectures for you to enjoy. But this evening, I'm very excited to hear from Jan and Lin as they re-examine the architectural brilliance of a building that has inspired a nation, a profession, the whole world, the Sydney Opera House. And they will share the stories of their father, Jorn Utzon's experiences and the legacies that he's left them as a family. And I'm also delighted that they're joined by our Honorary Professor Richard Johnson, AOMBE, another UNSW alum, who worked with Jan and Lin and Jorn Utzon on the realisation of the Utzon Room and Tapestry here at the Opera House. So thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you to all of you in the audience, both here and on the live stream, who have and continue to support us at UNSW in everything that we do, in our research, in our education, and our partnerships. We strive to make the world and our cities a better place. Thank you, Edwina.
Thank you, Claire. Now, the Utzon Lecture tonight is going to be a little unconventional in structure. It's going to be a more interactive event, and everybody in the audience, both in real life here and also in real life on the live stream, can join in if you'd like to. Later on, there will be the opportunity for you to go to a microphone, but if you're introverted and don't feel like standing up in front of a whole lot of people, we have you covered. You can take your phone out or any device that you've got and go to Slido, which is an interactive question asking tool. So if you Google Slido or type in slido.com.au to your phone and then use the code UTZON, you can get asking questions away, because I am sure that Jan Utzon, who is going to talk for a while before we throw open to a wider conversation, will provoke many questions. So before we get to that though, I'm very pleased to welcome Jan Utzon to the stage to deliver some thoughts.
Thank you, Edwina, and thank you for being here tonight. Before I start talking about the Opera House, I want to thank the Sydney Opera House and the University of New South Wales for inviting my family and myself to Sydney to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Opera House. For me, it is actually the 66th anniversary, because the building began its existence 66 years ago in my family in 1957. And from then on, the Sydney Opera House has taken up so much space in our lives that I feel it's actually my whole life here. And I've been really grateful to be able to have hands-on in the building later on in life. In 57, my brother Kim was born in January, and a month later, my parents got a notification that, Jorn, you have won this competition for Sydney Opera House in Australia. I didn't know what Australia was. I was only 12 years old. But Lin, she ran down the path to greet my parents who hadn't heard this yet and said, Mom and Dad, you won the competition in Sydney. Can I have a white horse? I let Lin answer that later. But my father then borrowed money in the bank to travel to Sydney because it cost at that time more than a year's wage for an architect to come to Sydney in the first place. He came to Australia and was greeted wonderfully by the Australian people, and he went to meet with Joe Cahill, the then Premier. And Joe Premier said, Jan, come on, sit down, have a whiskey or whatever. And he said, Jan, is there anything I can do for you? Please let me know. My father said, well, actually the competition site is rather narrow, and on the side there are 2 large sheds that are available for harbour purposes. It would be wonderful if those sheds could go away, because then we can expand the site a little bit. And Joe Kiley got on the phone, he talked to somebody that my father, from the one-sided conversation, gathered was the harbour master. And then Joe Kiley said, Peter, you are harbour master of this particular part of Sydney Harbour. What if I make you harbour master of the entire Sydney Harbour? Democracy. And he put the phone down and turned to my father and said, the sheds are gone. There will be questions about Kyle's role and all of that. I'll leave that to the question and answer afterwards, because he was really a great advocate for starting the Opera House in the first place, in the sense that he said to my father, get going immediately. We start building now. My father said, no, well, we just have competition drawings, sketches almost. And Kyle said, if you wait and we do all the documentation first and get the right prizes, it's never going to happen. But my father went from party to party, and everybody was so excited about this new project. And somebody said, okay, we start collecting money for the project, and who will pay X amount of pounds? You'll kiss the architect and you pay the money. And my father was a little bit taken aback, but okay. And then, of course, the Sydney Opera House lottery was established, which paid for the entire structure over the years that passed. Over the next 6 years, my father frequently traveled from Denmark to Australia in the development of the project and the initial construction phases. And he always traveled via other countries like Japan, China, Nepal, India, Iran, and saw and was inspired by all these different types of architecture, their surfaces, their colors, just piling on inspiration all the time. He did not copy things, but he got inspired by things, and he used them in this project here. The office in Hellebæk had a large international staff with people from Norway, from Austria, from Spain, from Japan and Denmark, and a few from Australia as well. And that was interesting for me as a young boy to go from the school via the office to my home, or to our home, because I interacted with these young architects, and there was a wonderful ambience in the office of this is a fantastic project, and we have the opportunity to do something which is unique. So the office was sought by many people. In '63, the family arrived in Australia. We migrated to Australia. We expected to be living here the rest of our lives. Unfortunately, that did not happen. And it was a great adventure for us. And we were flying along and landed in Sydney, where my parents were whisked away in a limousine down to Sydney Harbour to have lunch with Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip. So you could say it was a different type of immigration that a lot of other people made. And Lin and I, we went to an Arabian school, boys and girls school, and my little brother, he started school, he was 6 years old, so he went to local valley school up at Bayview. But it sort of immersed us in the Australian society in a wonderful way that we wouldn't have had if we'd been sort of fully educated. After school, I started architecture at the University of New South Wales, and Lin went to Sydney Tech, and life for us was in Paddington, where we stayed with some friends in the terrace house those following years. And we had a wonderful life, like sort of what you have when you're 18 till you're 20. It's something that really sticks in your mind. In '65, the Labour government lost the election to the Liberal Party, and following that, there was some discussion about how this building, or the construction of the building, should be continued, because the new government didn't really like the way my father had been going. It was, let's say, it was an unusual way to make a new building. Since we're celebrating the 50th anniversary, I won't go into that. You can ask later if you will. But we had to leave Australia and went back to Denmark. The one unfortunate thing that happened when we got back to Denmark was that my father was called for a meeting at the Danish Institute of Architects, where he was placed in front of the then dean of, not the dean, what they call him, president of the Architecture Federation, and said that what you have done is detrimental to the role of an architect. You cannot leave a job, and the client is always right, and we are going to make sure you never get a public job in Denmark, which my father never did. Luckily, he had other jobs outside of Denmark. He had a theater going on in Switzerland, and when that ended, it wasn't really, it was never going to be built for some reason. He got a job in Hawaii, where he taught architecture at the School of Architecture in Honolulu for some years. And during that time, we got an invitation to participate in an invited competition for a new parliament building in Kuwait, which we won. And the next 5 years, we were busy with this project, first the project and then the construction of it in Kuwait. A great period also in my life, because I was, by that time, I completed my studies and was sort of head of that particular project in Kuwait. Then in all the years that followed our departure from Australia, we had so many guests from Australia and elsewhere in the world, from architects and writers and movie makers, that all wanted to talk about the Sydney Opera House. And the Sydney Opera House by then was completed, and everybody seemed to be loving the building a lot. But in my family, the Opera House continued to have a certain life throughout the period until we were approached, my father was approached by the then Opera House Trust in 1999 by Joe Skrinsky, the then chair, inviting him to re-engage with the Sydney Opera House and with Australia and provide assistance in developing documents that would be beneficial to future architects when they are doing work at the Opera House. They will have a document that tells them what my father was thinking, his sources of inspiration, his working methodology, and a lot of other little details that enabled him to do what he did. So when some architects in 50 years, 100 years hence, look at this document and have to do something about the Opera House, they will have a background that would enable them to perhaps do something a little bit closer to what my father was aiming at if they didn't read the paper. So that paper we developed together with Richard Johnson and his office and the Conservation Council and other wonderful people here in Sydney. My father said yes to this invitation, provided that his son, namely myself, Jan, could take on the job as his representative in Sydney. So I have been here since '99 until a short while ago, 2 or 3 times a year. So Sydney has certainly become my second home. The first time I came, I went to see Bob Carr, the then Premier, and I put on the suit that my father had on when he met Joseph Cahill, and we had a good laugh about that. And when I landed at the airport, you have to show your passport, and the guy looked at the passport, he looked at me and he said, with a big smile, "Back to the scene of the crime, eh?" And I was meeting the trust. I was taken care of by many wonderful people, especially Joe Skrinsky and Richard Johnson, whom we were to work with for the next many years. I was gathering information, photos, videos, and so on, going back to Denmark to discuss this with my father, trying to develop the documents that I was just mentioning. Working with JPW, Johnson, Pilson, Walker, Richard Johnson, and many kind, motivated people, we succeeded, I think, in making these guides that would provide future decision makers to come up with solutions that would be closer to what my father wanted. During this time, I was dealing with a number of administrations over the years, and during my last years, I was invited to be part of a newly established eminent architects panels that consisted of eminent architects who would be an advisory board for the Sydney Opera House Trust and for the CEO and for the future of the Opera House. I think as we now occupy this unique building, that you, the citizens of Australia, have made a landmark for Sydney and an icon for Australia. I wish you a heartfelt congratulations with the Opera House. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I mean, it must have been an absolutely extraordinary moment for a family of a, emerging architect living in Copenhagen to get this news. Lin, do you remember how the news was received in your family, and do you remember, other than nursing equestrian fantasies?
That didn't happen.
It didn't happen. Oh, no. Controversy.
I would say euphoria. People, around my parents were absolutely ecstatic. Imagine, as a young architect, to look into a possible future, asking him much, much more than he ever imagined. He could really fly, and it was just brilliant.
So, taking a step back from the victory, what was the process like for your father in sort of getting to the point where he could make his submission to the jury for consideration? I mean, how much thinking and how much planning and how much kind of, work did he put into that?
How do you mean, when he was proposing?
When he was developing the proposal.
Well, I was 10. I didn't exactly stick around. I was doing my own things, but he spent day and night on that competition.
Maybe I can add to that My father's education finished during the Second World War, and there's not much going on. So a lot of architects did competition work. So they became very adroit in a few days to whip up a proposal that could be understood and graphically grasped by a jury. When you do things like that, then you, for many of these projects, they were never going to be built, but they got a sort of post-graduation exercise out of it. So when my father got well, I could say, first of all, my parents, they traveled through United States and Mexico in 49. My father traveled to Africa in 48. He went to see other architects, renowned architects across the United States and in Scandinavia. So he was piling on sources of inspiration, and he had you could say, a visual vocabulary that was enabling him to come up with all sorts of ideas for all sorts of different constellations of purposes. And that ability to do that, it's a bit like a wonderful poet. I mean, he has the same 26 letters to work with, but some people can actually make something out of that that's beyond what we normally can do. And he had that ability there with his work.
Because he took his inspiration from lots and lots of different sources, didn't he?
Yes, he did. He was fascinated by pretty much anything, nature, other people's work, but mostly indigenous architecture in countries like Mexico, Central America, Japan, China, and other more sort of, you could call it quiet traditional architecture. He wasn't really interested in what was then the vogue, the Italian or French Renaissance architecture, but more in sort of the substantial background for architecture.
And did that have something to do with the fact that a lot of indigenous architecture or sort of more traditional architecture is often more responsive to nature?
I think he had a sense, you could say, a sensitive soul that allowed him to, for instance, walk up the steps on the Mayan pyramid and in the flat landscape with a forest up to 10 meters high, you couldn't see anything. But then when he walked up, he was on a plateau above the forest and could see the sky and far in the distance. And that feeling for him was a kind of spiritual elevation that he could use in some project in the future. I don't think he actually thought about which project, but it was in his bank of ideas, if you will.
And that of course, was one of the inspirations for the monumental steps.
Exactly, and the podium that we're sitting on.
So, of course, then the jury made their decision, and the announcement was made in Sydney and in Australia. And in fact, Jan has brought with him something quite special that I hadn't heard before, which was a broadcast that was made as part of the announcement of the competition winner, informing Australians about the winner. And he's brought some audio of that, an interview that was made, I'm assuming, by the ABC, although when I tried to find its provenance, I couldn't. And I don't know who the journalist is either, but can we have a listen to it, please?
The first question addressed to Dr. Martin would be, what was the deciding factor in the minds of the jury which affected their choice of the winning scheme?
Well, perhaps I'd better say what was in my own mind. I felt that we had to satisfy ourselves that the schemes would work, but I realized that in this particular case, it was not just a question of choosing a scheme which would work and then leaving it at that. We were choosing a design for a great building. I have been looking for a building which not only worked, but which also contained an idea, and I think we've selected one.
Mr. Saarinen, could you describe any outstanding feature which you feel impressed itself on the assessors?
I would say that it wasn't so much a question of outstanding features, it was the total concept of the whole thing as one outstanding piece of art. The very simplicity of the plan was one thing which worked so well together with also the character of the building, the festive quality of the architecture, which was, as one might say, intertwined with the structural system for the whole thing, with the plan, with the way the people moved in it, with the way Bennelong Point was used, the placing of the buildings so that the vistas were the nicest from the places where the people were, and also all that combined with how it would look from outside of Bennelong Point. In other words, it was all these qualities intertwined, which was the outstanding feature of this design.
This competitor has taken the idea of the shell vault, which he's then used in a very interesting way to cover this large space over the auditorium. And the attractive thing about it is, I think, that as you look at this building from the water, it will have something of the character of the sails of yachts, the things that one sees on the water. It fits its position extremely well. There's just one other thing about it. Designing an opera house is really a very difficult problem because there's always a stage tower which comes shooting through the building, and that is an extremely difficult thing to handle in relation to the building as a whole. Now, the stage tower in this case is enclosed in one of these shell vaults and takes its place absolutely perfectly within the general silhouette of the building.
So we heard there from, as well as the anonymous interviewer, we heard from Professor Leslie Martin, who at the time was the head of the School of Architecture at Cambridge University, who was one of the jurors, and Eero Saarinen, who was an eminent Finnish-American architect of the time. So they were explaining their thing, and I found that fascinating. One of the things that it raises, which I think was a really interesting one, was that one of the things that appealed to the jurors was that this building served a practical purpose, but also contained an idea. So, Richard, what do you think about that, this idea of the idea? What was the idea for you?
I think there are two aspects of the building that really are so outstanding, and they make the building arguably the definitive piece of architecture of the 20th century. The building has, a unique sense of place. It shows a mature understanding of the ancient topography of this peninsula and the way it folds down into the harbour, an understanding of the harbour setting, the colour of the sky, the harbour bridge, and the then contrast with the city of brick and tile, the contrast of the white against the masonry city. But in addition, there was the aspect of appealing, not only understanding the context, but appealing to the human spirit, to elevate the spirit, to prepare somebody on the journey from the city to the house, to prepare them by crossing that great piazza connected to the water, to prepare themselves for the performance. So these human qualities and almost sculptural qualities and understanding of place are unique in the 20th century.
It was art to experience art. The other thing that really struck me in that audio recording was that Professor Martin spoke about the idea of simplicity in this building. And, I've heard a lot of adjectives applied to this building, extraordinary and revolutionary and amazing, but not often simple. That seems counterintuitive to me. What do you think the jurors meant by that, Jan?
Well, the beauty of a competition scheme is that you make a scheme that shows, at least to my father's way of thinking, it shows the main idea and it ignores all the little, it didn't show any toilets, for instance, or doors, and things like that, or electrical wiring or anything. It showed the idea, I want to take the people of Sydney across the open space. They see the shape of the building and they get excited about, I mean, it's a prelude to the performance they're going to see, walking up the steps, trying to get people to have the same feeling that you had when you walked up the steps of the Mayan pyramids, and then enter the venues on top of this plateau, which would house all the functions that would provide means from actually creating the performances. The brief actually said there should be 90 permanently employees in the Opera House, and today there are about 1,000, I think. And of course, that's changed a lot. But it is a very complicated building in the normal sense, and it was complicated to make. But the strength of the design, where you see it from afar, whichever way you see it from, you see a podium, and you see what we call the sails or the shells above it. And that's the main impression you get. And that has been retained throughout.
So, your family gets this extraordinary news, and you prepared to emigrate to literally across the world. I mean, a trip to Australia, to Sydney from Copenhagen, wasn't particularly straightforward at that point, was it? So, how did you prepare for the trip, Lin? And do you remember much about the journey itself?
Well, I remember very well the announcement that we were going to emigrate and that we were going to have a very long trip, an adventure. Our parents really wanted to give us a fantastic experience that we would never forget, and they did, because we traveled slowly around the world to the Caribbean, going across America, going to Hawaii, Tahiti, and then ending up, in a way, back in Europe. It was very English at the time, and very surprising to have made, months of traveling to arrive in something that was so familiar.
So Sydney felt like Europe.
Yes, and it was very English.
Right.
At the time.
Yes. And can you be a bit more specific? Can you remember something that made you go, "That is very English"?
Well, the architecture, the red brick houses, and the gardens,
the pubs,
the men who were with their socks up to here and their shorts, and all those things, the afternoon tea, the school uniforms, all that was kind of very alien to having seen the native people of Hawaii, having been in Tahiti, having been close to the Mexican border and seen all that wonderful nature and troubled area. And so it was more familiar than at least I anticipated. And then, of course, when you get to know this magnificent country, it's not, because it's all that other world, the bush, the enormous nature, which we don't have in Europe, where everything is combed and, gardened and controlled in a way.
The wildness.
Yes.
How about for you, Jan?
Well, I felt, we grew up in the forest. My parents, when they came back from the United States in '49, they looked for a site and found one in the middle of a state forest and built a house. So I was living or grew up in a bush. So when I came here, we moved up to Bayview, and my parents had bought a piece of land where they were overlooking Pittwater and up to Lion Island, and we were going to be there, and of course the Coringa chase, and the outdoor life, the sports and everything. When I was 18 at the time, it was really something I could relate to very much. So in that sense, my problem was, of course, my English was really lousy. I got bottom grades in English in Denmark, at Danish school, But then I got stuck into this new school in Narrabeen, and of course I learned by being there.
Richard, do you remember or can you reflect now on what it all meant for a Sydney-sider?
Well, I was at UNSW studying architecture when this building was emerging magically from this site. A group of us found out that you could get access to the site through the security fence at a particular time. And so we constantly came and wandered around the site, avoiding as security guards. And intuitively, I mean, we didn't know anything really, we were just students. But intuitively, we all felt that there was something magical emerging from this place. And it's something that stays with you. It is magic. And the more you know the building, the more you realise how extraordinary it is.
In terms of, you know, as the construction got underway and your father was having to deal with an Australian crew of engineers as well as Danish people and people from all around the world, I suppose, but also the Australian government, how and the Australian sort of public, how was that relationship sort of for him? How did he manage that and what did he bring home? Was there a sense of how great it was to work with the Australians, or was there a sense of, what are we doing here?
When he came back from his first visit to Australia, he was really super enthusiastic about looking into a future where we would go to Australia, because he was received with such warmth. I remember he brought back a lot of different seeds from Australian plants he'd been given. He'd been taken to a cricket match, and he said it was 2 hours, nothing happened. Well, when he turned around, looking back, and at that instant something happened. He just didn't see it. But he was taken on so many different, people really wanted to show him Australia, and that of course was such a sign of goodwill towards him and the project at the time. And Lin mentioned Hawaii before. I just got to think that on one of his trips, he stopped over in Hawaii. Remember, at that time it was propeller planes. They had to have small jumps to get here. And he was stopping over, and he went to the hotel and got out on the balcony. And there's a whole group of people out there and waving and shouting. That's amazing. How do they know anything about the Opera House? And then he noticed, no, maybe, and he looked up to the next balcony up, and there was Elvis Presley.
Who was only slightly more famous, really. So, you know, very famously, as the construction went on, there were some cost blowouts. But when I was listening to that piece of audio that we listened to before, that report, there was a section where the jurors were discussing the cost of this proposed building, and I wouldn't mind playing that because I think it's really interesting in hindsight to listen to what the jurors said at the time.
Now, Professor Martin, another leading question, and one of primary interest to our promoters. The report states that the cost of the winning scheme was less than the others. Why is this so, and what would the cost be?
I think I'll answer first of all, why is this so? It is so because the scheme is basically so very simple. There is a base to this building, the one which was described as being constructed out of stone, but of course I think within that undoubtedly the main structure would be reinforced concrete. That is a very simple thing to build, very straightforward, and it contains all the backstage accommodation, all the workshops and the entrance halls. Over that, there are these shell vaults which cover the auditorium. The shell vaults, I think, although they are quite costly things, are really extremely well used, extremely directly used, and therefore I think the enclosure of the space is done in a very simple way. So that I would say that this competitor has eliminated most of the difficult things from building. He's eliminated height. He's eliminated escape staircases. He's cut out a lot of the useless and dead space which one might find in an opera house, and therefore he's produced a building which can be built more cheaply than some of the others. Now, I don't know what you want me to do. Am I to be the first man to give the cost of this building?
You'll not be the first man, Leslie, because I gave it some time ago. I leave the honor now to you.
Well, we had the assistance of some quantity surveyors, so this figure is not my own. We had a number of schemes priced. They ranged over quite a wide range of costs, but this particular project is, I think, within the figure that you had in mind of about £4 million, and is in fact £3.5 million.
Yeah, it ended up coming in at around £51 million, which was funded, of course, substantially by the Sydney Opera House Lottery.
Can I just say that this discussion took place within the jury before my father, he knew he had won the competition.
Really? So this all proceeded? That's funny. And so he hadn't had a serious conversation with them about cost either, I imagine.
He didn't know at the time he'd won the competition. He hadn't been notified of it.
Well, that seems a bit cheeky, isn't it? You'd think that if they were talking publicly about it, your father would have known. But look, I do want to sort of talk a little bit about that because, I mean, of course, no one questions the cost of this building now. I mean, nobody, I think, regrets it. It was all sort of covered, and I think we're all super proud of it. But was there a sense, both in your family, of sort of, was there a sense that things weren't going exactly to plan?
I think, in a way, it didn't come into it. There was something completely other happening, which was, I will refer to something I saw here in Australia. You had a Minister of Culture who was a rock singer, and forgive me, I can't remember his name.
Peter Garrett.
Yes. And he produced a record where you have an image of Sydney which has disappeared after a volcanic eruption. The only thing that's left is the Opera House. And it feels, and I think, I mean, I'm not answering your question, but it feels as if the Opera House was found, was excavated, and somehow was there as the most brilliant, beautiful reminder of what architecture and art and nature could be. So in a way, the hand of God had excavated that. That's how it felt. I don't know how my father felt. He didn't feel like that because he didn't have that distance to it. But he was so devoted and so concentrated, and he was a genius. So it was something completely other. That's how I feel it.
No, I think we can all applaud that.
Yeah.
So did you get to, I mean, Richard as a student was running around the site as it was being constructed. Did you get to visit the site much, Jan and Lin? I
didn't visit it that much. I visited it, and I happened to go to the conservatory next to it. So often I would go there, and then I would go to the office, and Dad and I would drive home together. But as such, visiting deliberately the site, not really, not for my part. I went to East Sydney Tech. I was doing, all my paintings and stuff.
You were being an artist.
Yes.
And I can say that when we came initially, we moved to Bayview, and went to school of Narrabeen, and then we moved to. I think when we finished the school in Narrabeen, Lynn and I moved to Paddington to study here in the city, but my parents moved to Palm Beach for the remainder of our time here. And that meant before, while we were students in school, we didn't have a car, I mean, Lin and I, but so we rarely got to the building site. But after I went to Paddington and studied architecture, I came relatively often to the building site to chat with the architects at the office and to see the building site, walk around, talk to some of the guys working in the building. And that makes me think that the Opera House could only have happened in Australia. If this competition had been won, if this competition had, my father had handed this project in anywhere else in the world, it would not have been chosen at the first prize. And, but because it was in Australia and because of this pioneering spirit, and people, well, obviously Joseph Kyle, he said, okay, the jury says so-and-so, I'll abide by that, let's do it. And it was, he said that without really knowing what he was getting into. I think nobody really knew what they were getting into, and because of that, it happened. Because of the people of Australia had this attitude in many layers of society, it happened here in Sydney. So one thing is my father's design for the building. The other thing is that you could call the background society supported this in a sufficient way to to realize the project itself. So you, the people of Sydney, have made it possible.
Well, it feels like an extremely fortunate time and place that it all happened. It felt like a sort of meant to be combination of events. Richard?
Yes, I think Europe was repairing after the Second World War, and really internationally, no one was building cultural buildings. They were building more essential housing that had been bombed or destroyed. So there was a sense of optimism in the new world. There was a sense of wanting this city to take its place internationally as a great world city. And we were fortunate to have Premier Joe Carl, who had the vision, and we've all benefited from that.
And he remained supportive of the project right up until he lost office, right?
Yeah, and the whole start of the project, when Dad came down, when you think of the bureaucracy surrounding architecture now, when Dad came on his first visit, I remember him telling that Kyle asked him, "Can you do it?" And Dad said, "Yes." And he said, "Okay, go ahead." That was...
There were some challenges with the construction itself as well, right? Like, my understanding is that a lot of the concrete was prefabricated and brought in by barge. Is that a correct?
Actually, the podium structure, the basic structure, is concrete was poured on site, and some pylons were poured that would support the coming of the sails. And suddenly there were explosions heard in the city because the pylons had been calculated wrong by a factor of 10. So instead of 3 by 4 meters, they made them 30 by 40 centimeters in the cross section. But it was rectified, no harm done. And if you think of this building, and that was why it also received a lot of criticism from certain quarters, it was unusual in its shape and its concept, and the normal way of dealing with construction was based on you make square buildings, same level, same floors, so and so many, and the structure was normally known and everything like that, so you could schedule all the different processes. Here it was something new. It's a bit like if you go back to 1850 and somebody says, "I want a carriage." It does not have to be one of these with horses. It should be without horses. And it should be able to go 50 miles an hour. And you should be able to sit comfortably. And if it rains, there should be something removing the rain from the big windows and so on. And should have some lights that can light ahead. It was a bit like that, the job here, to create a new car, if you will, in a place where no cars had been made before. And that's where a lot of these, you could call it the contemplation of how to make the shells in the first place. It must be admitted the competition scheme had non-geometrical shapes for the shells. It was sort of felt like a shape coming up like that. And engineers obviously couldn't really make it happen because there was no way to calculate such a shell. It was only when my father said, after some years, inscribe all the surfaces of the shells in the same spherical shape. Then we can separate them or cut them down into pieces that can be geometrically defined. We can decorate them in a certain way, and we can assemble them into parts of a sphere that we need for the shells. That solved a lot of problems, but it couldn't happen overnight. You had to work with a thing year after year, or month after month anyway, to arrive at such a solution. So many of the solutions developed for the Opera House were a result of intense investigation into multiple solutions or possibilities.
Richard, did you have something to add there?
I think one of the remarkable things about the building is that, and Jorn talked often about working at the edge of the possible, so there was this sense of great striving for excellence and innovative solutions structurally and architecturally that to this day have benefited the industry in this country and globally. For example, the use of computers, pioneered by Arup for the structure of this building, pioneered the use of computers in architecture worldwide. And there are many innovations in concrete technology, in pre-stressing and post-tensioning and all sorts of things. And Jorn was developing extraordinary technologies using plywood and moulded plywood with hot bonded lead for acoustic reasons in Homebush factory by Ralph Simons. There are many, many innovations that emerged from this building that flowed on to the construction industry as a whole. It's fair to say that in Sydney, we build reinforced concrete tower structures faster and more efficiently than almost anywhere else in the world. Many of the tall buildings internationally are steel, not concrete. The concrete technology came out of the Opera House.
It makes it even harder to put a price on it, doesn't it, when you think of what it's given back?
That's right, indeed.
I think also the way my father or our father worked was he concentrated absolutely only on the problem at hand. When we left Denmark, he passed the projects he had there to someone else because he knew this one would be so demanding that he wouldn't be able to think of anything else. What he was absolutely brilliant at was to find the key to each problem, and the main key being the spherical solution, which was that he could, with elements, create the spheres. And in fact, that solution is a key to the whole rest of the Opera House, if you look at what it could have been. Because the interior acoustic was based on element or the spherical design, and it repeats itself not only with the Opera House, but with anything he's done. He finds the key to that specific problem, And when the building is built, you become aware of where you are in a completely different way.
I can add to that he, with the Opera House, he began to investigate and refine the ideas of breaking the old. He grew up in an age where everything was made by hand. If you wanted to have a lamp, you went to somebody who could make a lamp, because there was no IKEA or production and things like that. You could just buy things off the shelf. But he was growing up with a generation where the industries developed, and he thought we must go for industrially produced elements in the future, but we can do that in a way that allow us to have the same harmonious or humane expression of architecture or items as we had before. It does not have to be regimented like soldiers on a row. And he saw inspiration in Chinese architecture, for instance, where they have bits and pieces that they decorate in a certain way, simple way, but when they put them together, there's a richness to that architecture. And he also at one stage made a model showing this of a curvilinear shape of 1.5 meters in height, made of so many different elements. And then he took 5 little elements and he added them together each time, but turning and twisting them just to show how you, with the same element, could make the same shape. And that would enable you to make wonderful things in a much cheaper way than you could before.
It does feel particularly poignant, I think, that as your father was becoming more and more absorbed by the problems that the building and the site were posing, his relationship with the new government was deteriorating. And it's not the time to dwell on that tonight, but of course he handed his resignation into the government, it was accepted. You both had your lives here at this point, and as Jan said, were expecting to stay here for a very long time. How was that disruption for you both, just on a personal level?
Well, I think for me it was strange because I'd gotten used to being in Sydney, being in Australia. We travelled around the southern and eastern part of Australia, at least. At that stage, we didn't really feel an urge to go to Darwin, go to Perth or wherever, because we were going to live here, so we can wait, which didn't happen, of course. I've seen those places later on, luckily, but I think for a long time, my parents and we with them hoped that we would be called back. But the new government decided to change the brief, the program for the building in such a way. They chose different architects. Peter Hall must absolutely be mentioned, Hall, Todd and Littlemore. They did, under the circumstances, a fine job in trying to do something with the building as it was when my father left it. My father was cut short in the way that the government didn't pay him his wage simply, so he had to let all his staff go. And we had no income, or he had no income that would allow us to stay on in Australia. So in that sense, we just had to leave. But the new architects were faced with a different adjusted program, among other things, to take the opera function out of the major hall, which is today the concert hall, and place it here. And they would tear the existing, or at a time existing stage tower, they tore it out to make room for a much larger concert hall, which is the one we have today, and things like that. And
although Peter Hall,
they had a great trouble trying to satisfy their government client in that respect.
Lin, do you remember going back to Denmark? Was that a wrench or?
Yes.
Or
it was devastating. I was terribly, terribly unhappy. And because I loved my life in Australia, I was, I suppose, very self-centered. I wasn't so focused on my parents' problems as on poor me, leaving everything I loved. In the end, Australia did give me everything, because my children's father's Australian, they are Australian, my grandchildren are Australian, and I've been coming back, I don't know how many times, but every year and a half. And I love this country for the same reason as all of you do, I suppose.
Well, you're one of us now, really, aren't you?
Huh?
You're one of us now, really, aren't you?
Really, yes.
There's a common myth that your father was not invited to the opening of this building 50 years ago on Friday. In fact, as anybody who might have visited the Museum of Sydney's exhibition at the moment about the history, and if you haven't, you should go, it's free and super interesting. There's a letter there from Jorn Utzon in response to the Premier, Mr. Askin, and his invitation to be here on this night. And reading it, it is one of the most polite and elegant stuff yous I've ever read. I would quite like to just quote from it just briefly, if you'll let me. Jorn Utzon writes, if I were to go to Sydney, it would not be possible for me to avoid making very negative statements. And as I cannot be the guest of the Government of New South Wales and at the same time criticise one of its ministers, Davies Hughes, I am sorry to say that I will therefore have to refrain from coming to the opening of the Sydney Opera House. Did you watch it on TV?
No.
No?
No.
I can't recall that we saw the opening itself. We just, in Denmark at least, barely had color television. It was still black and white. But but we saw so many pictures, so they all blend into one big impression, if you will, as filled us with what was going on. And no matter what my father felt, we felt when we saw it the first time. It was a marvelous building.
Oh, very good. But of course, you know, the involvement didn't actually end there, and you were invited back. And Richard, this is where you play a very pivotal role in the story of this building, because you led the Australian side of a renovation that was commissioned in the late 1990s. Would you like to tell us about how you became involved?
Well, leading up to the Olympics, a master plan had been done, and with only 2 years left to implement some critical changes that were seen to be necessary at the time, and some expressions of interest were called from architectural practices, and our practice put a submission in, and I was sent along to the interview, and I didn't want the job, and so I said, Joseph Skrinsky, the chairman, was chair of the interview panel, and I said, look, if you want me really to implement this master plan, I'll just leave. I won't waste your time, but if you're interested in knowing what I think about how you should proceed, I'll stay. He said, please proceed. So I said, the architect is alive. We can't be altering this masterpiece without at least making an attempt to talk to him. And I think Joe Skrinsky then had long discussions and finally appointed me as advisor to the Trust. And subsequent to that, after discussions that Joe had with a number of people, the idea of inviting Utzon came, and various approaches had been made, a meeting had been organised, and I only played a small role. There were many people that played pivotal roles in this rapprochement, but I was the lucky person that took 2 letters, one from Bob Carr and one from Joe Skrinsky, to invite Utzon to be the architect of the building again, and to assist in looking at the future of the building and documenting his principles. So that's the role I played.
And so how were you received? Because you went to Mallorca?
I did. I was terrified. I mean, I was terrified for many reasons, and wondered on that rainy journey up the mountains to that marvellous house how I got myself into this mess. Because I really felt that I could, in fact, grieve him. I could raise issues that would trouble him, and that he'd given us so much. He deserved his privacy. He deserved his peace. So, but of course, I was welcomed generously, with great generosity and humour, and Liz, your mother, she was so warm and friendly, but also cautious to make sure that no issue was raised that would cause him grief.
But you clearly did a good and tactful job because he became involved, right? And that must. How was that received from the Utzon family end?
After many years of not living with the Opera House, but living with it, and never being publicly aggrieved about what happened, there was a marked relief, which was really wonderful. And I have to mention, Joe Skrinsky was absolutely instrumental in a lot of this, and so was Peter Collins, who was the Minister of Culture, who put the plinth with the construction principle up here in the forecourt, and who allowed an exhibition to be shown of all the drawings that Davis Hughes and I can't remember who else, but said had never been drawn. Very courageous, and it started this whole desire to make peace. It started that ball rolling slowly on and on. And, yes.
And one of the really, I think, important and lasting legacies to come out of this period and this collaboration are the Utzon design principles, which is a extraordinarily detailed and well-researched document that outlines how this building needs to be maintained, and was extraordinarily instrumental in the recent renewal project. Richard, how did that document come about? What was the process of that? And Jan, you were hugely instrumental in that as well.
I think, yeah.
Because it's quite a unique document, isn't it?
I think it is. The Getty Institute now use it as a benchmark for dealing with 20th century items of heritage significance. But the building was not completed by Utzon, so in a sense, knowing and requirements changed over time. So knowing what he was going to do was not necessarily the way for the future of the building, because requirements were different. But trying to get into the mind of the architect through a set of ideas and principles and a way of approaching problems, as Lin talked about, the DNA of thinking for a genius. That's what the document is trying to do, and it's all in his own words. It's everything in that document is directly from him. The document was not possible without Jan's constant involvement. So my role was as part of a team.
We'll go to questions shortly. There are mics on the lower level there, and on the upper level there and there. If you do have a question that you'd like to ask Jan or Lin or Richard, please find your way there.
Can I just say that my role here, as Richard has explained, has been to facilitate connection between Australia and my father, and it has brought my father very close to Australia, and I think a lot of Australians closer to my father. And for me, it has been, well, just a few months ago, I was giving a talk to fellow architects from Australia in Denmark, and they awarded me the honorary fellowship. Thank you.
Congratulations. So we do have some questions coming in on Slido. Thank you very much for submitting those. There's one that's actually pertinent a little bit, I think, to what we're talking about now, which was, is there any part of the Opera House that was not designed by Jorn that you think was an interesting addition?
Silence?
Yes, I can say that because the opera function was taken from the concert hall, there was no need, the stage tower went away and there's no need for underground stage facilities. So suddenly 3 new theaters were developed, and out of a room that housed air conditioning, it was then removed. There was a new foyer, and there was a bit seedy looking, drab looking, and so it was not something my father had designed, but the situation made it interesting to look at this issue. And if you can imagine that you have a house and you design something that is good for this particular purpose, and somebody else comes and says, we want to do something else, you can't use original ideas anymore. You have to think anew, which we did in collaboration with JPW. So that sprang as a new design, which actually could have been done by anybody else because it was new.
We have a question from Evelyn Jones on the Slido. She asks, you spent your formative years growing up in Sydney, meeting locals and luminaries from the arts community. Can you recall any special memories of this time? Lin, you were at art school. Do you have any good memories of any?
I have many. I have a life of memories, because I made many friends at the time when I went to East Sydney Tech, and we stayed friends. So every single time I came back to Australia, I would see those friends, or they would come to Europe and visit me. And of course, I married my husband, my ex-husband, 2 years after we got back to Denmark, and had my children. And so I have many wonderful artist friends here, and really love to see them. And
I'll tell you later.
No, Jan is telling me to name names.
So yeah, please feel free to come to the mics, and also, you know, we all know the difference between a question and a manifesto. So when you come to the microphone, please keep your question succinct and to the point. Oh, there, number 1. Yep.
Only one so far. Fascinating. Lovely to hear you speak again. I just wanted to ask a couple of things in terms of design principles that I haven't heard addressed very much. Firstly, the Bennelong restaurant, which is a strange little add-on, and nobody really talks much about the design process. Was it always meant to be a restaurant, or was it an add-on after the original design process? And secondly, you touched upon the fact that what's unique about the Opera House in staging, and particularly this theatre, is because of the fact you've got the lifts, the stage lifts, you can actually change the set, and you can have a matinee of one opera in the afternoon and a different opera in the evening. Just wonder if that principle has actually percolated through to other designs of performing arts centres around the world, and was it in fact a pioneering technique?
I'll defer to one of the architects on the panel for that.
Well, the Benelong restaurant, or what's known as that, was initially not really given what it was supposed to be. I think it was meant to be a restaurant, but early on in the drawings it appears with a lettering saying restaurant. So it was there before the construction commenced. Because there was, of course, a dialogue between my father and the client here. The second one is because of the constraints of the site, the unusual thing about the performance techniques here would require that you take everything up and down rather than out to the sides or back, because there are no backstage, there are no side stages. So everything was with big elevators going up and down. We are sitting in the UNSW Theatre now. There's a revolving stage underneath us. It has never been used because the opera function was moved here, and the opera orchestra is a large one. A theatre orchestra is a small one which could fit in the designed orchestra pit, but the large orchestra demanded that you extend the orchestra pit back underneath the stage, preventing the revolving stage from being used. But there's things that have been done in the best of interest for the people at the time, for the questions at the time, that later on you think, why did they do this? Why did they do that? Why didn't they do this? And there will always be situations like that. In Madrid, the opera was rebuilt 11 times.
Yeah. We have a question at microphone number 3 up the top there, please.
Yes, hi. My name is Daniel Coburn. I'm the son of John Coburn, who designed the curtain, which is behind you. I'd like to say how much respect my father had for your father, and being a modern painter, of course, back in the 60s when the project first started, he was very excited that such a building was being built right here in his home city. And he was also, I'm sure, outraged at the, being a Labor voter, he was outraged at the, what happened when the Liberal Party came in, and he was part of the protests, I'm sure, of when when you all returned to Europe. But I think his disappointment changed to excitement when he was commissioned to design the Opera House curtains. And I'd like to ask a personal question, which is, when your father saw the curtains, whether he thought that they fitted in with his vision for the Opera House, and whether he was pleased with the final, again, the final outcome of what Peter Hall did to the Opera House.
I can tell you that my father, he contacted the French-Swiss architect Le Corbusier and Picasso with the intent of having them on the team that would decorate and color the Opera House eventually. But this was before the base concrete was actually finished. So it was very early on. So he envisaged a lot of textiles, a lot of colors. So when he saw your father's curtain, he was really excited that at least that expression had been taken up and followed.
Lovely.
It's a magnificent curtain, and it's such a treat to be sitting in front of it. Thank you. Now, is that a question up at number 4 or no? Sorry, I thought it was. So I think that one of the real things that most of us take from this building is a sense of inspiration and a sense of what is possible. Ian, you told me a story yesterday that moved me quite a lot, actually, about something that you heard, a letter that your father received. Would you be able to share that?
I hope so, because I get very... Sorry, I can't do that.
Oh.
I get very moved. Okay, switch internal track. There was this woman who sent my father a letter way back, and in that letter she stated that she was going on a ferry to drown herself in the harbor. And that was a serious business, of course. But then she wrote, she was looking in the water and she saw the reflection of the Opera House and lifted a view and saw the Opera House. And then she decided, sorry. Take over.
Okay, and she saw the image of the Opera House and decided if somebody could overcome all those difficulties and build something so magic and so uplifting, who was she to take her own life? And so she didn't.
Thank you. I think that this is the power that human creation has, and we're so fortunate to be living in a city where we get daily reminders of exactly that. Now, before we finish tonight, I actually have a really lovely next task to do, and that is to invite to the stage the President of the Australian Institute of Architects, Stuart Tanner, who has got some special announcements to make.
Thank you. Dear Air, it is indeed a great honour to be standing here wearing the Australian Institute of Architects chain of office, which was designed by your father in 1965 for the Institute. And so to be wearing this here tonight with you both is really wonderful. And what a great honour it is. And because of that, I wish to thank you and your family for your dedication to the global profession of architecture and design, and for the care of your father's legacy and design in all its forms. Your stewardship is a marker for all to follow, Jan and Lin. Few buildings are granted birthday parties, and we are very pleased and honoured to welcome you both here at these celebrations. Over the past 15 years, the Sydney Opera House has undergone major refurbishment. This became an opportunity for the building to reposition and realign with the original design vision of Jorn Utzon. And to guide us on this quest, we have been incredibly fortunate to have had your support. Indeed, Australia is incredibly fortunate for the generosity of Jorn and his family and the beautiful welcoming I received when I was in Denmark. And we thank them for ensuring that Jorn Utzon's design vision is retained as a living evocation. Tonight, we recognise also the strong connection between the Australian Institute of Architects and the Danish Institute of Architects, and how this significant project binds us both as both professional organisations, countries, and peoples. As we celebrate the first 50 years of the Opera House, it is the next 50 years that the Institute sees as critical. The role we would play as custodians of this masterful work is vital. The Sydney Opera House has become to define us as people and as a place. Therefore, we hope that the Utzon design principles are respected on into the future. I have visited the Opera House on many times over my lifetime, and each and every time I'm privileged to experience this World Heritage listed site, I am reminded of the site's origin, in that under this supporting podium is the landform of Chiboli, the place and gathering and ceremony for the Gadigal peoples. The precinct exudes atmosphere to this day, and Jorn's ingenious podium with its Mayan and Acropolis origins is the bedrock that both replaced and became the site. This beautiful platform grounds the exaltation of the shell forms to this special terroir. A new place of gathering and ceremony and celebration now exists, treasured by all. Every time I approach this extraordinary building, I am struck by its presence. On each and every visit, I am moved by its capacity to move as if it's alive. Every time, I am left breathless by an architecture that transforms the light that is refracted by its very form. And every time I depart, I realise that the pearlescent shells of Chiboli still gleam in the moonlight. And so, I am reminded that I have witnessed how great architecture can elevate our experience to be something spiritual and ethereal. May all people who visit this beautiful and transformative work over the coming 50 years leave with such a feeling. Jan and Lin, we have your father, you and your family to thank for this incredible cultural gift to all Australians and all people everywhere. And so it is my great honour that I present to both of you honorary memberships of the Australian Institute of Architects.
Well, thank you, Stuart. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Jan. Thank you, Richard. And thank you all for coming tonight. It really feels like a celebration. And it really feels like exactly the way that we should be celebrating this remarkable building. Thank you very much.
It's one of the biggest honours of my life to do this.
Can I say something? I just want to say that this is incredibly moving and that, well, it's like having a family back.